He woke up not knowing his name, not knowing his past, not knowing the war he had started, the empire he had built, or the thousands of people who had died because of choices he could no longer remember making. He was handed a lightsaber and told he was a Jedi. He believed it. He had no reason not to. He was also Darth Revan, the most feared being in the galaxy, and he had absolutely no idea. This is the story of a man who fell to the dark side and chose to, who built an empire not out of cruelty, but out of conviction, who was betrayed by his closest friend, rebuilt by his enemies, and still managed to find his way back. A man who died more than once and came back more than once, whose shadow stretched across thousands of years of galactic history, long after the galaxy had stopped saying his name out loud. But to understand how a Jedi Master became a Sith Lord, and how a Sith Lord became something the galaxy had no word for, you have to go back to the beginning, before the mask, before the war, before the fall. You have to go back to a child. He was discovered on some forgotten world in the Outer Rim, so deeply attuned to the Force that the Jedi who found him could barely contain their excitement. The records from that time are incomplete, as most records from the era of the Old Republic tend to be, and the Jedi Order did not always document its initiates with the same care it applied to other matters. But what is known is that this child arrived at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant very young. Young enough that whatever life he had lived before the Order became little more than a vague impression, a scent without a name. The temple became his home. The other initiates became his family, and the Force, vast and luminous and inexhaustible, became the language through which he understood everything. He was not always called Revan. That name would come later, chosen or earned, or perhaps simply recognized as the truest thing about him. In those early years, he was simply another student in the long halls of the temple, moving through the forms of lightsaber combat, sitting in meditation, learning the history of the Jedi and the Republic and the galaxy that stretched out in every direction beyond the windows of Coruscant. But even then, even as a child, those who watched him could see that something about him was different. Not dangerous, not yet, but different in the way that a flame is different from the candles around it. Brighter, perhaps, and less contained. His mind was extraordinary. That much was clear from the beginning. Where other students approached problems methodically, step by careful step, Revan seemed to arrive at conclusions through some process that bypassed the steps entirely, as though he could see the destination before he had taken a single stride toward it. His instructors found him simultaneously gratifying and unsettling. Gratifying because a mind like his was rare, truly rare, and the Jedi Order had always understood the value of rare things. Unsettling because a mind that worked the way his did was also harder to guide, harder to contain, and more likely to ask the kind of questions that teachers prefer not to answer. He asked those questions constantly, not with defiance, at least not at first, but with genuine curiosity, the kind that cannot be shut down simply by telling a child to be patient or to trust in the wisdom of those who came before. He wanted to know why certain techniques were forbidden. He wanted to understand what lay on the other side of the Force's brightest edges. He read everything the archives contained. And when he had read everything, he wanted to know what was not in the archives and why it was not there. The masters who taught him gave him what they could. They explained the dangers of the dark side, the importance of emotional equilibrium, the weight of the Jedi Code, and the wisdom it encoded. Revan absorbed all of it. He believed all of it, in his way. But belief and compliance are not the same thing. And even as a young student, he was already quietly noting the distance between what the Order said and what it did. He found his closest friendships among the students who shared his appetite for depth. There was a quality to those early relationships that would define him throughout his life. A fierce and unconditional loyalty to the people he chose, a willingness to sacrifice almost anything for those who had earned a place in the circle of his trust. He was not warm in the easy, effortless way that some people are. He did not smile easily or speak lightly. But when Revan gave you his attention, you felt it completely. And when he gave you his loyalty, it was the kind that did not bend. The masters who took an interest in him understood that a student of his caliber required careful handling. Not because he was volatile, though he would become so, but because a mind that could touch both the heights and the depths of the Force with equal facility was a mind that needed to be directed rather than constrained. Constrain a river, and it finds another path. Direct it, and you can build a civilization on its banks. The Jedi tried to direct him. For a time, it worked. He rose through the ranks with a speed that was remarkable even by the standards of the gifted, attaining the rank of Jedi Knight, and then beginning the long work of mastering everything the Order had to teach. But the galaxy outside the temple was not static. The galaxy had its own momentum, its own tragedies, and one of them was already building on the edges of Republic space, massive and inevitable, like a tide gathering itself before it breaks. The Mandalorians had always been a warrior culture. That was not unique in a galaxy full of species who had organized their civilizations around conflict. But the Mandalorians were unique in the particular intensity with which they held to that identity. War was not simply a means to an end for them. It was a way of knowing, a way of testing, a way of determining what was real and what was not. They were a people who had survived centuries of conflict by being harder, faster, and more relentless than everyone they faced. And for a long time, the galaxy had simply not presented them with an enemy worthy of their full attention. That changed when Mandalore, the ultimate, the supreme warlord of the Mandalorian people, began to look outward with new purpose. There were theories, even then, about what drove him. Some said it was simple ambition, the hunger of a great warrior for a great war. Others said that something deeper was at work, that the Mandalore had been influenced by forces outside himself, whispered too by something that wanted the conflict to happen, that needed the galaxy to bleed, for reasons that would not become clear for a very long time. Whatever the truth of his motivation, the result was the same. The Mandalorians began to move, first against the outer rim worlds, which fell quickly and without the kind of resistance that might have given the Republic pause. Then closer, always closer, pressing inward toward the heart of the Republic, with a patience and a power that most of the Senate could not quite bring itself to fully reckon with. The Jedi Council watched. That was, initially, all they did. Watch, deliberate, consult the Force, reach for clarity, find ambiguity. The Council was composed of beings of genuine wisdom and deep experience, and their caution was not cowardice. They had reasons for it that they believed in sincerely. The Force, they said, was unclear on the matter. Intervening directly in what appeared to be a political and military conflict was not the Jedi's role. The Republic had armies. The Republic had generals. The Jedi were peacekeepers, not soldiers. To throw the Order into the grinding machinery of a galactic war was to risk everything the Order stood for, to risk the clarity and the balance that made the Jedi what they were. Revan heard this reasoning. He sat in council chambers and listened to it articulated by some of the wisest beings he had ever known. And he found that he could not accept it, not because he thought the council was corrupt or foolish, but because he was standing at a different vantage point and seeing something they were not. He was young enough to be closer to the war, closer to the reports coming in from the Outer Rim, closer to the faces of the refugees who arrived on Coruscant with nothing, having left everything behind. He listened to the survivors speak about what the Mandalorians had done to their worlds, and something in him hardened, not into rage, not exactly, but into a kind of certainty that was quieter than rage and far more durable. He began to talk, not in official channels, not in council meetings where every word would be weighed and measured, but in corridors, in training rooms, in the quiet corners of the temple where conversations could happen without being recorded. He talked to other Jedi Knights, the ones who were close to his age, the ones who had also been reading the reports and asking the same questions and receiving the same careful, unsatisfying answers. He did not speak with the urgency of someone trying to convince people of something that might not be true. He spoke with the calm of someone sharing what seemed to him to be simply obvious. The Republic was losing. People were dying, and the Jedi, who had the power to stop it, were standing aside. They called themselves the Revanchists. The name came to cluster around them naturally. Those Jedi who agreed with Revan, who believed that the Order's refusal to act was not wisdom but failure, and who were willing to say so openly. There was something electrifying about it, about the way a simple disagreement could feel when enough people shared it, like the beginning of something irreversible. Revan was not yet using that name for himself. That would come later. But the movement that was forming around him had his fingerprints all over it, his arguments in its mouth, his conviction in its bones. The council was not pleased. Masters who had spent decades cultivating their equanimity found themselves frustrated by a young knight who could argue rings around most of them, and who had, worse still, a knack for framing his position in terms of compassion and courage that made the council's counterposition sound like timidity. They tried to reason with him. They tried to redirect him. They pointed to the Force and said that it offered no clear guidance toward intervention. Revan listened respectfully and went right on talking to people in corridors. And then, finally, he stopped waiting for permission. It is difficult to overstate what it meant for Revan to take this step. The Jedi Order was not merely an institution to the people who had grown up inside it. It was the frame through which they understood themselves, the tradition that gave their power meaning and their choices context. To defy the council was not simply to break a rule. It was to step outside the framework of meaning that had structured his entire life. To say that he trusted his own judgment more than he trusted the accumulated wisdom of centuries. It was an act of profound conviction, and it was an act with a cost that he would spend the rest of his life paying. He left with those who chose to follow him. Not all the Revanchists came. Some stepped back at the last moment, unwilling to make the final leap, but many did. Jedi Knights and Padawans who had heard him speak and felt the truth of what he was saying, who had looked at the war on the Outer Rim and felt the same thing he felt. Among those who followed him was a man who had been his closest companion for years, a Jedi who matched him in ambition, if not quite in brilliance, who was loyal to him in a way that was total and unquestioning. or so it seemed then. His name was Malak, and his story and Revan's story were bound together so tightly that you cannot tell one without the other. They went to war. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in the history of the Old Republic. And what made it remarkable was not simply the scale of the victories or the speed with which they came, though both were extraordinary. What made it remarkable was the mind at its center. Revan proved to be something that the galaxy had rarely seen before and would not see again for a very long time. He was a strategic genius of the First Order, a being who could look at a battlefield or a system of worlds and see possibilities that no one else could see, who could move forces across light years with a precision that made his campaigns feel less like wars and more like arguments. His pieces placed so perfectly that the conclusion almost seemed inevitable, even before the first shot was fired. He did not fight like a traditional military commander. He had not been trained to fight like one. He was a Jedi, and his approach to warfare carried the imprint of that training in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes not at all. He understood people. He understood what drove them, what they feared, what they needed to believe about themselves in order to keep going. He understood supply lines and logistics with the intuitive grasp of someone who had spent years thinking about systems and how they worked. He understood when to strike and when to wait, and when to offer an enemy a way to retreat that preserved their dignity, because a humiliated enemy fights harder than a defeated one. The Mandalorians, for the first time in their campaign against the Republic, met someone who could match them. Not in raw ferocity, because the Mandalorians had made ferocity into an art form over centuries, but in will and in cleverness, and in the ability to think 3 moves ahead. The battles that Revan's forces fought against the Mandalorian clans were brutal, as battles with the Mandalorians always were, but they had a different quality than the engagements the Republic's regular forces had managed. They felt, to those who survived them, like something was being decided, like each engagement was a step in an argument whose conclusion was being slowly and inexorably established. Malak was always close. Revan's closest friend, his most trusted general, the one he spoke to when the weight of command became heavy enough that he needed to put it down for a moment and just think out loud. Malak was powerful in the Force, fearless in combat, and devoted to Revan with an intensity that sometimes made others uncomfortable, as though he had transferred the totality of his identity onto the man he followed, as though Revan's cause had become his cause so completely that he had no cause of his own left. There were people who found this loyalty admirable. There were others who found it unsettling, who sensed in it a hollowness at its center, a devotion built not on solid ground, but on the fact that Malak had not yet discovered what he himself truly believed. But these were observations that came much later, in the light of what happened afterward. During the war, Malak was simply there, at Revan's side, and his presence was a reassurance and a source of strength that Revan came to rely on more than he may have realized. The war went on. Republic worlds that had been falling were held. Lines that had been crumbling were steadied. The Mandalorians found that for every gambit they attempted, Revan had already prepared an answer. The tide began, slowly, and then, with gathering speed, to turn. And as it turned, something else was turning inside Revan, something slower and more difficult to observe. War changes people. This is not a complicated truth, but it is a profound one. and the manner in which it changes them depends on what they bring to the war and what the war does to those things. Revan brought intelligence, conviction, compassion, and a deep belief that what he was doing was right. The war, over years of attrition and difficult choices and the accumulation of deaths for which he bore at least partial responsibility, began to do something to those things. The conviction deepened into something harder, less flexible. The compassion did not disappear, but it developed a colder edge. The compassion of someone who has learned to make triage decisions, who has learned that saving many sometimes means abandoning some. The intelligence, always formidable, began to be applied not only to the question of how to win, but to the question of what winning actually meant, and what the galaxy would need to look like afterward, and what it would take to hold it together. He began to study the dark side. Not to use it, not yet, but to understand it. The way a general studies his enemy's tactics. The Sith had been making war on the galaxy for thousands of years, and every time they rose, they had to be defeated again, because the structures that defeated them were never strong enough to prevent the next rising. The Republic was vast but brittle. The Jedi were powerful but isolated from the real mechanisms of political power. The whole system, as Revan saw it, was a beautiful machine with a fundamental design flaw. And he began to think about what it would mean to fix the flaw, what it would require, whether it was something that could be done from inside the existing order, or whether it required something more radical. These thoughts were a door, and he had opened it just a crack, and the thing on the other side was patient and had all the time in the world. The war's final act came at a world called Malachor V. It was a barren, ancient place, a graveyard world in a system that most navigational charts flagged simply as dangerous, and its significance lay not in anything it had been before the battle, but in what it became during it. Revan had laid a trap there, or something that functioned like a trap, the kind of military strategy that is brilliant and horrifying in equal measure, that works precisely because it is willing to go further than the enemy expects. He had a weapon. It had been built quietly over the long years of the campaign by engineers who understood what they were building only in the most technical sense, who perhaps did not allow themselves to think too carefully about what it would mean in practice. It was called the Mass Shadow Generator, and what it did was manipulate the gravitational force of the planet itself, amplifying it to catastrophic effect. Everything in range of its activation, Republic ships and Mandalorian ships alike, would be caught in that amplified gravity and destroyed. Revan ordered its activation. What happened at Malachor V was a massacre. The Mandalorian fleet was annihilated. The Mandalorian ground forces were destroyed. Mandalore the Ultimate was killed, and with him, the governing will that had held the Mandalorian clans together, that had given their long campaign its direction and its purpose. The Mandalorian Wars ended in the space of a battle that lasted only hours, because no enemy can continue a war after its heart has been ripped out. But the Mass Shadow Generator did not discriminate. Republic forces died in enormous numbers at Malachor V. Soldiers who had fought alongside Revan, who had trusted him, who had followed him across years of a terrible war because they believed in what he was doing. They were caught in the generator's effect and they died, and the ones who survived were changed by surviving in ways that would take years to fully surface. Something tore in the Force at Malachor V, something structural, something deep. The world itself became a wound, a place where the Force did not flow the way it was supposed to, where the echoes of so many violent deaths had accumulated into a darkness that would persist for years. warping everything that came near it. Revan knew what he had done. He did not pretend otherwise. He stood at the edge of what Malachor V had become, and he looked at it, and he carried it, the way he would carry everything that the war had cost, without flinching and without fully processing it, because there was still work to be done, and he had learned, over years of war, that the work does not wait for grief. But something in him had shifted. Something that had been held in careful balance had tipped. The willingness to make the hard choice, which had always been a part of who he was, had now been tested at a scale that changed its meaning. He had sacrificed his own people to end the war. He had decided that the mathematics of survival justified what he had done, that fewer people would die in the long run because of what had happened at Malachor V than would have died if he had not been willing to go that far. He believed this. He continued to believe it. But belief that has cost that much is no longer the same as the belief you had before. He returned to the Republic, a hero in the technical sense, a man who had won the war that the Jedi Council had been too cautious to fight, who had saved worlds that would have fallen without him. He was celebrated, and he accepted the celebration with the quiet composure that had always characterized him. And behind his eyes, something was turning over, something new, something that would lead him away from the Republic even at the moment of his greatest triumph. He had been thinking about a question for a long time. The question of what lay beyond the edge of Republic space, out past the outer rim, in the regions that most charts labeled as unexplored or simply empty. He had encountered hints during the war, fragments of intelligence that suggested the Mandalorians had not simply decided on their own initiative to launch the greatest military campaign the Republic had ever faced. Something had moved them. Something had whispered in Mandalore the Ultimate's ear and told him that the time was right, that the Republic was vulnerable, that the prize was worth the risk, and that something was not Mandalorian in origin. Revan went looking for it. He and Malak went together, slipping out of the Republic before anyone could ask too many questions about where they were going. Following the threads of intelligence that Revan had been quietly gathering for years, pointing their ship toward the darkness beyond the outer rim and pressing forward. They were seeking the source of the influence that had set the Mandalorians in motion, the thing behind the thing, the hand inside the puppet. What they found was the true Sith Empire. The true Sith had not disappeared when the last known Sith Lord had fallen. This was a truth that the Jedi Order had allowed itself, quite humanly, to believe because it was comforting, because the alternative required a vigilance that was exhausting to sustain indefinitely, because the Force had not given them clear and unmistakable signs pointing to the contrary. The Sith had retreated. They had gone far beyond the borders of known space, to a world called Dromund Kaas, shrouded in perpetual storms, hidden in the deep dark of the galaxy's outer edge. And there they had rebuilt, not quickly, not loudly, with a patience that only an immortal creature could sustain, because the being at the center of it, the Emperor who sat at the heart of the true Sith Empire, like a spider at the center of a web, was not governed by the ordinary rhythms of mortality. His name, the name he had taken for himself, was Vitiati, though he had been born with a different name on a world called Medrias, which no longer existed because he had consumed it. He had performed a ritual that had killed every living thing on his home planet and used the energy of those deaths to make himself something other than human, something that did not age, that did not tire in the ordinary sense, that had accumulated power over centuries into a form so vast and so deep that it was difficult to perceive from the outside. You could stand in his presence and feel it the way you feel. The pressure of deep water, a force that surrounds you completely, and whose full extent you cannot measure because you are already inside it. Revan and Malak found their way to Dromund Kaas. What exactly happened when they arrived, what they saw, what was said, is a matter that the records handle with some delicacy, because the records themselves are products of a perspective that had been fundamentally altered by the encounter. What is known is that Vitiate was prepared for them. He had been watching the Mandalorian Wars, had, in fact, had a hand in setting them in motion, testing the Republic, measuring the Jedi, seeing what kind of instrument the galaxy's dominant civilization was, and finding it, on balance, somewhat fragile. Revan and Malak arriving on Dromund Kaas was, from his perspective, the next phase of an experiment, not an interruption. He invited them. He hosted them. He showed them his empire, the sheer scale of what had been built in the silence beyond the outer rim, the armies and the fleets and the infrastructure of a civilization that had been growing for centuries, while the Republic congratulated itself on peace. He showed them the dark side of the Force as they had never seen it. Not the careful, forbidden, but theoretically understandable dark side of the Jedi archives, but the living thing itself, in its full and terrible depth, a power that did not merely enable its users but consumed them, remaking them into something harder and more absolute. And then he did something that neither of them had been prepared for. He performed a ritual, using both of them as subjects, and when the ritual was over, they were different people. Not entirely, not all at once, but the architecture of who they were had been altered at a foundational level. Their connection to the light side had been weakened. The dark side's voice had been amplified. Their own ambitions, their own beliefs, the certainty that had always driven Revan, had been reshaped by Vitiate's touch into something that served his purposes. He sent them back to the Republic, not as his servants, exactly. The situation was more complex and more troubling than simple servitude. He had intended them to serve as advance agents, to destabilize the Republic from within, so that when the true Sith Empire finally moved, it would find its prey already wounded. But Revan, even with everything that Vitiate had done to him, was not a simple instrument. The corruption was real, the alteration was real, and the dark side was genuinely taking root in him, in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. But something in Revan resisted the idea of being anyone's tool. Some part of him that Vitiate had not been able to reach, not quite, not entirely, retained enough of its original nature to subvert even the Emperor's intentions. Revan went back to the Republic, and he decided, in a way that he himself may not have been fully conscious of, to build something of his own. Not a weapon for Vitiate, an alternative. An empire that could actually defend the galaxy against the true Sith when they came, because they were coming, they were always going to come. And the Republic as it existed was not going to survive that encounter. The darkness in him and the conviction in him had become nearly indistinguishable from each other. And what they produced together was Darth Revan. The Jedi Order had expected the heroes of the Mandalorian Wars to return changed. War does that. They had not expected this. Revan arrived at the edge of Republic space, not as a returning champion, but as a conqueror with a fleet behind him and a Sith title before his name, and a philosophy that had shed its gentler elements like a snake sheds skin. Malak was with him, also transformed, also carrying the mark of what Vitiate had done, and what the war had done, and what the years had done. And the two of them together was something that the Republic could not immediately process, because they had been its greatest heroes, and now they were declaring war on it. They had found the Star Forge. It was an ancient space station built by the Rakata, those force-sensitive conquerors from the galaxy's distant past. And it functioned as a kind of ultimate manufacturing engine, drawing on the power of a nearby star and on the dark side of the Force to produce ships and weapons with a speed and quantity that conventional manufacturing could not approach. With the Star Forge, Revan could build a fleet faster than the Republic could destroy it. With a fleet of that size, he could conduct the kind of rapid total war that would force the Republic to its knees before it had time to properly organize a response. He was not simply waging war for the sake of destruction. Revan did not do things simply. His vision was architectural, as it had always been. He saw the Republic and its flaws, its corruption and its fragility, and the comfortable blindness that had made it so vulnerable to the Mandalorians and would make it even more vulnerable to the true Sith. He intended to replace it with something stronger. An empire that had learned from its own weaknesses, that had no room for the kind of senatorial self-interest that slowed everything to a crawl, that could mobilize its full power without the complicated machinery of democratic debate. He believed, or he told himself he believed, that the galaxy needed this, that the cost of what he was doing was worth what would result. He had also accepted the dark side, not entirely on Vitiate's terms, but on his own. The power it offered was real, and Revan was too honest in his strange way to pretend otherwise. He drew on it. He used it. He built his new Sith order around a philosophy that was his own creation, different from the old Sith and different from the Jedi, something that acknowledged the Force in its entirety rather than pledging allegiance to only one half of it. He was still, in some meaningful sense, the person who had left the Jedi Order to fight a war because the alternative was to stand by while people died. The core of that conviction was still there, but it was operating now through a framework that had absorbed too much darkness to remain what it had been. Malak was at his side, and Malak was simpler in his darkness. Where Revan's fall was complicated, tangled with genuine purpose and strategic vision, Malak's was cleaner and in some ways more complete. He had always defined himself through Revan, and what Revan became, Malak became, but without the qualification, without the secondary motivations that kept Revan's actions from becoming purely destructive. Malak loved war in a way that Revan did not. He loved the power and the destruction and the clarity of it, the way that strength resolved ambiguity. He was becoming something that the galaxy would find, in time, far more purely dangerous than his master. The Sith fleet moved against the Republic with the efficiency and precision that had characterized all of Revan's military campaigns. Worlds fell. Republic forces were overwhelmed not just by the scale of the assault, but by the intelligence behind it, the uncanny accuracy with which Revan's strikes landed, the sense that the defenders were always a step behind, always reacting rather than anticipating. Key shipyards were seized. Naval commanders defected. The Republic found itself fighting a war it had not prepared for against an enemy it had never expected, and with a military apparatus that was still recovering from the Mandalorian Wars that had ended only recently. The Sith took Forost and its shipyards, crippling the Republic's capacity to replace the vessels it was losing. They pushed through system after system with a relentlessness that felt, to those in its path, less like a military campaign and more like a natural disaster, something too large and too purposeful to resist. Key to these early victories was the defection of Saul Karath, one of the Republic's most capable admirals, who recognized in Revan's cause something that the Republic's slow and fractured leadership could not offer him, and who brought his considerable expertise to the Sith fleet under Karath's command. The military machine that Revan had built became even more precise in its application, striking not randomly, but at the specific nodes of Republic, military, and economic power that would hurt the most. And at the center of it all, directing everything from the bridge of his flagship, was Darth Revan, who had once stood in a Jedi temple and asked questions that his teachers could not answer, and who had now, in his own terrible way, answered some of those questions himself. He was still himself. This is important to understand. The person who commanded that fleet, who made those choices, who built that empire, was not a stranger wearing Revan's face. He was Revan, changed and darkened and operating through a framework that had absorbed more of the dark side than was healthy, but recognizably, undeniably himself. The intelligence was still there. The conviction was still there. Even the compassion was still there. In its altered form, the compassion of someone who believed that he was doing something necessary, something that would ultimately result in fewer deaths than the alternative. He did not permit his forces to engage in the kind of gratuitous brutality that would make reconstruction impossible. He preserved the infrastructure of the planets he conquered because he intended them to be part of what came after, part of the empire he was building. He was, in his strange and terrible way, still thinking about the future. But the Republic was not simply going to accept this. And the Jedi, who had once refused to fight the Mandalorians, could not stand aside while one of their own used everything he had learned in their halls to tear the civilization they had sworn to protect apart at the seams. Among those who answered the call to fight Revan's forces was a Jedi whose name would become as closely linked to his story as any of the names that had come before. Bastila Shan was young, still, but possessed of a rare ability that made her extraordinary, even among the gifted. She had battle meditation, a force power so unusual and so powerful in its application that it functioned less like an individual talent and more like a tide, capable of lifting the morale and coordination of friendly forces, while simultaneously undermining those of the enemy, turning the immaterial qualities of courage and will into genuine tactical advantages that could shift the outcome of battles that should, by every conventional measure, have been decided already. She was also, behind her talent and her discipline, a complicated person. She carried within her a certainty about the rightness of the Jedi path that had not yet been fully tested, and that would encounter, in the events that were coming, stresses it had never been designed to survive. She was brilliant and sincere, and, in the way that very sincere people sometimes are, somewhat ungenerous toward complexity. She would learn. Events would teach her, but she had not yet begun that education when she joined the strike team that the Jedi Order, assembled with a single purpose: kill Darth Revan. The plan was audacious and desperate in the way that plans formed under pressure often are. The Jedi could not defeat Revan's fleet through conventional engagement, not with the Star Forge producing ships faster than the Republic could destroy them. They could not outmaneuver him strategically, but they could, perhaps, cut the head from the body, remove Revan himself from the equation, and Bastila's battle meditation made her the most valuable piece on the board, capable of giving the strike team a window that would not otherwise exist. They boarded Revan's flagship. What followed was a battle that moved through the corridors and chambers of a Sith warship. With the contained intensity of a storm in a bottle, Jedi moving through spaces that had been designed for war by a mind that understood war better than any of them, against opponents who had been trained by that same mind. People died. People on both sides. The strike team pushed through. They found him. The confrontation between the Jedi strike team and Darth Revan was the kind of moment that history tends to smooth over in the retelling, turning it into something clean and dramatic with a clear before and after. But moments like that are never clean. There is the man with the mask standing in the center of everything he has built, and there are the Jedi who have come to end him, and there is Bastila, whose battle meditation is the only reason the strike team reached this far, and there is the galaxy outside the viewport, continuing to exist with complete indifference to what is being decided inside this room. They fought. Revan was extraordinary, as he had always been extraordinary, and even together, the strike team was pushed to its limits. And then something unexpected happened that would change not just this battle, but everything that came after. Malak, observing from outside, made a decision. He ordered his ship to open fire on Revan's flagship, his own master's flagship. The rationale, if he had one, was that with the Jedi strike team aboard, with Revan potentially captured or weakened, the moment presented an opportunity that might not come again. An opportunity to be free of the man who had always stood one step ahead of him, who had always been the master in every sense, while Malak had been the apprentice, brilliant but secondary, powerful but derivative. He told himself whatever he needed to tell himself. And he fired. The barrage hit the flagship and the chamber they were fighting in. And in the chaos of the impact and the destruction, something happened to Revan that was neither death nor survival in any ordinary sense. He was hit. He was gravely wounded. His mind, struck by the combination of physical trauma and the force backlash of the attack, shattered. Bastila, by instinct or by something deeper than instinct, grabbed him before he could fall into the void, wrapping him in force energy, keeping him alive through sheer will while everything around them was burning. She got him out. She brought Darth Revan, wounded and unconscious, and barely held together, to the Jedi Council on Dantooine. And the Council looked at what she had brought them and made one of the most controversial decisions in the long and complicated history of their order. He was not dead. He was not recoverable, not in the form he had been. His body could be healed. His mind, in the state the Council found it, was another matter entirely. The memories were fragmented. The personality structure was present, but damaged, like a building that has taken a severe blow and lost large sections of its load-bearing wall. They could have let him die. The argument for that was straightforward enough. Darth Revan was responsible for a war that had killed millions, for the fall of worlds, for the corruption of other Jedi, for a campaign of conquest that was still ongoing under Malak's leadership. The galaxy would not have mourned the decision, but the Jedi have never been simple creatures. And the Masters on the Council of Dantooine were not simple. They saw in Revan's broken state something that required them to think past the obvious choice and into territory that made some of them deeply uncomfortable. He knew things: the location of the Star Forge, the structure of his Sith forces, the strategic logic behind his campaign. Things that, if they could access them, could end the war. And beyond the practical considerations, there was the matter of the Force, which had placed Bastila in that corridor at that moment, which had ensured that Revan did not die, when by all rights he should have. The Force does not act randomly. Its choices, even when they are difficult to interpret, carry weight. They made their decision. They did not execute him. They did not imprison him, not in any ordinary sense. What they did was something that had almost no precedent in the history of the Order, and that the Masters involved would not speak of openly for years afterward. They reached into Revan's broken mind with the Force, and they reshaped what they found there. They did not repair him. They rebuilt him. They took the fragments of what remained and constructed around them a new identity, new memories, a new personality, loyalties directed not toward the Sith but toward the Republic, a history that was clean and simple and entirely false. When Revan woke up, he did not know who he was. He knew the cover story the Council had given him. He knew the fake name, the fabricated past, the manufactured memories of a soldier's life and a Republic upbringing, and a connection to the Jedi that was real, but framed in entirely different terms from the truth. He was told that his memory had been damaged in the war. He was given a posting on a ship called the Endar Spire, under the command of Bastila Shan, who was one of the very few people who knew the truth, and who must have found the situation profoundly strange, to look at this man every day and know what he had been while he remained entirely ignorant of it. The Council had not told him. They operated on the belief that the ends justified the means, that saving the Republic from Malak's war and from the threat of the Star Forge was worth what they had done to one man, even if that man had brought much of the disaster on himself. They were not entirely wrong, but they were not entirely right either. And the gap between those two positions would become significant in ways they had not fully anticipated. For a time, the man who had been Darth Revan simply existed as someone else. He served aboard the Endar Spire. He trained. He operated within a framework that had been constructed for him by others, and that fitted him the way a costume fits a person who does not know they are wearing one. There was something underneath, always. A quality to the way he moved and thought, and approached problems that did not quite match the ordinary soldier he was supposed to be. Bastila noticed it. Others who spent time around him noticed it. He was too good at things he should have had only a passing familiarity with. Too insightful in situations that should have been beyond his experience. The person the Council had built was a convincing surface. But beneath the surface, the original was still there, dormant and waiting, and more present than anyone involved in the project had fully accounted for. And then Malak found the Endar Spire. The attack was not random. Malak's forces had been tracking Bastila, because Bastila's battle meditation was the single most significant tactical asset the Republic possessed against the Sith war machine, and eliminating her would have been worth almost any cost. The Sith fleet that dropped out of hyperspace to intercept the Endar Spire above the planet Taris was overwhelming in its intent, if not in its subtlety. The ship's crew understood within minutes that they were not going to survive this. The man who had been rebuilt as an ordinary Republic soldier found himself moving through a collapsing ship with an efficiency and a calm that the situation did not warrant. He was not panicking, he was problem-solving. And the problems presented by a ship under heavy enemy fire, with corridors filling with smoke and structural failures cascading through the vessel's systems, were being solved by him with a speed that suggested the solutions were coming, not from what he had been told he knew, but from something older and deeper. He found an escape pod. He found a companion, a Republic soldier named Darth Onasi, a man with his own complicated history and his own reasons for being aboard this ship at this moment. They made it out. They landed on Taris. And the journey that would eventually give Revan back to himself had begun. Taris was a world of contrasts, a city planet where the gleaming upper levels housed the wealthy and powerful, and the lower levels descended through layers of increasing desperation into places that sunlight had not reached in generations. It was controlled by Malak's Sith forces, which had established a blockade around the planet to find Bastila, who had also made it off the Endar Spire before it was destroyed, whose escape pod had been tracked to Taris, but who had not yet been located. The Sith were methodical about their search. They were also brutal in the ways that occupying armies tend to be. And the people of Taris, particularly those in the lower levels, were experiencing the full weight of that brutality. The man who was not yet Revan navigated all of this. He acquired equipment. He established contacts in the criminal underworld of Taris, because the criminal underworld knew things that the official information channels did not, and because a man with his particular set of skills, which included a capacity for reading people and situations that he would have been hard-pressed to explain the origin of, was good at negotiating with complicated people in complicated circumstances. He found allies, a young Twi'lek woman named Mission Vao, street smart in the particular way that people who have grown up in genuinely dangerous places tend to be. A Wookiee named Zalbar, whose life debt he acquired through a circumstance that was partly luck and partly the kind of unconscious competence that kept surfacing in him when he wasn't looking. He found Bastila. She was being held in a gladiatorial facility in the lower depths of Taris, used as a fighter by a criminal organization that had not understood what it had captured. Retrieving her required exactly the kind of operation that most people would have found impossible, and that he assembled and executed with a confidence that was almost casual, moving pieces into position, addressing problems as they arose, walking into a situation that should have been chaos and finding the order inside it. She was surprised to see him. She was surprised, in particular, by how capable he was, by the quality of what she observed in him, which she recognized, and which frightened her a little, for reasons she did not immediately volunteer. They needed to leave Taris. The Sith blockade made that a problem that required solving, and solving it required a ship. The vessel they found was the Ebon Hawk, a freighter with a past as complicated as most of the people who had ever flown her. And the man who gave them access to it was Canderous Ordo, a Mandalorian warrior who had fought against the Republic during the Mandalorian Wars and who had ended up on Taris through the particular combination of circumstance and stubbornness that characterized his people. Canderous recognized something in the man whose plan he agreed to follow. Something that he couldn't quite name, but that felt familiar in the bone-deep way that warriors recognize each other, and he came along when the Ebon Hawk launched. They got off Taris. And then Malak, whose forces had finally determined that Bastila had escaped, and that the people she had escaped with were worth eliminating, along with everything else on the planet's surface, bombarded Taris from orbit He destroyed it. He destroyed the upper levels and the lower levels and the millennia of accumulated human habitation and all the people in them, to deny Bastila even a ruined world to return to. It was an act of violence that Malak committed with complete indifference. Because for Malak, the calculus was simple, and the people of Taris were a variable that factored out the ebon hawk ran. And the man who was not yet Revan watched a planet being destroyed on the ship's sensors and felt something move in him that he could not name. Dantooine was green and quiet, a world of rolling plains and ancient ruins. And it was to Dantooine that Bastila brought the man she was responsible for watching. The Jedi enclave there was smaller and less formal than the temple on Coruscant, and the masters who presided over it were, perhaps, better suited to handling situations that did not have clean solutions. They assessed him. They put him through tests with the Force crystals and the quiet process by which the Jedi establish what a person is capable of. What they found confirmed what Bastila had suspected and what at least some of the masters had already known. This man was extraordinarily Force-sensitive. His connection to the Force was the deep, structural, almost architectural kind that rarely presents itself and never really goes away, no matter what has been done to suppress it or redirect it. They began to retrain him as a Jedi. Officially, this was the beginning of his training. Officially, the story was that a man with latent Force ability had been discovered somewhat belatedly and was now being given the education he had always deserved. The masters who knew the truth maintained their silence. Bastila maintained her silence. He went through the forms again, the lightsaber exercises and the meditation practices, and the long conversations about the nature of the Force that he engaged, with a depth and a speed that continuously surprised the masters who were supposed to be teaching him, and who were increasingly aware that the dynamic of teacher and student was not quite capturing what was actually happening. He was remembering. Not explicitly, not in the form of clear, recalled events, but the knowledge was there, waiting to be touched. And every lesson brought him a little closer to something that was always just beyond the edge of his conscious awareness. He moved with the precision of someone who had done all of this before. He asked questions that went deeper than someone at his official level of training should have been able to reach. And sometimes, very occasionally, he would say something or do something that made one of the masters go very still and look at him in a way that he did not know how to interpret because he did not yet have the context for it. He was given a mission. The Star Forge had to be found. The Council could not locate it through conventional means, but they had determined that it was accessible through a series of ancient maps left by the Rakata thousands of years ago on different worlds across the galaxy, each one providing a piece of the coordinates needed to reach the Lehon system where the Star Forge waited. He was to find the maps. He was to bring back the information that would allow the Republic to destroy the Star Forge and end Malak's capacity to sustain his war machine. The companions who joined him on this journey did so one by one, each with their own story, each connecting to him in ways that mapped something he could not yet name. Karth Onasi, who carried his own damage from a personal betrayal that he was not yet ready to trust his way past. Mission and Zalbar, who had survived Taris with them. A Jedi named Juhani, whom he encountered at the edge of the dark side, and talked back from it with words that came not from training but from something deeper, something experiential. HK-47, an assassin droid whose personality was simultaneously unsettling and oddly clarifying, and whose origins turned out to be more directly connected to his own history than they first appeared. And others still, each piece of a larger picture that was assembling itself slowly and without his full awareness. He went to Kashyyyk, where the star map waited in the depths of an ancient and dangerous forest beneath the canopy cities. He went to Manaan, the water world of the Selkath, neutral in the war and deeply uncomfortable about the competing pressures being applied to it, where navigating the political tensions required exactly the kind of careful attention to competing interests that had always been one of his strengths. He went to Tatooine, a desert world of binary suns and long memories, where the map was buried in a place that required passing through ancient Rakatan machinery to reach. He went to Korriban, and Korriban was the hardest. The ancestral world of the Sith, the planet where their tombs were built, where the dark side was so thick in the atmosphere that it affected perception and judgment in ways that were difficult to shield against. Even for the well-trained, he went into the tomb of Naga Sado, as the mission required. And in the tomb, he found the star map and other things as well. Things that pulsed with dark side energy and that spoke to parts of him that the Council's rebuilt identity had covered over but not eliminated. He moved through it. He found what he needed. And he came out changed in ways that were small but cumulative. Because every encounter with the dark side was not merely a test of his new Jedi training. It was a test of something older. There was also the matter of the Force bond that had formed between him and Bastila. In the moment she had saved him aboard the burning flagship, a connection so deep and so unusual that it had been affecting both of them since the journey began, bleeding emotions and impressions across the distance between them in ways neither fully controlled. It was a complication that neither of them spoke about directly, at least not at first, because speaking about it directly would have required acknowledging too many other things. But it was there, always, and it was growing, and the distance between what it meant and what either of them was willing to say about it was a tension that ran through the entire voyage like a second current beneath the main one. And then came the moment that changed everything. He was aboard the Leviathan, Saul Karath's flagship, the vessel that had been the instrument of some of the worst military actions the Sith had committed during the war, including the orbital bombardment that had destroyed Telos, and with it, the family of the man standing at Revan's side. The whole crew of the Ebon Hawk had been captured, efficiently and without much drama, in the way that very well-planned captures tend to go, and the situation was a disaster, in the obvious military sense, and also something else, because Malak was aboard, and Malak had a reason for wanting them brought to him that went beyond anything strategic. He knew who was under the rebuilt identity. He had always known. He had been there, after all, on the day that Revan fell. He had ordered the attack on the flagship with his own hands. He had watched through sensor feeds as Bastila pulled the wounded body from the wreckage. He had spent years wondering what the Jedi had done with what they found. Arriving at a suspicion he now intended to confirm in person. They were separated. Bastila was taken in one direction, Revan in another. What happened between Karth and Saul Karath in that ship is its own accounting, a confrontation between a man and the person responsible for destroying his family, ending the way those confrontations sometimes do, with the responsible party dying before anything like resolution is possible, and leaving Karth with the aftermath and no clean way to carry it. But it is Revan's interrogation room that history remembers, Malak told him. With the cold precision of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times and chosen accuracy over theater, Malak gave back the name, the history, the war, the Star Forge, the philosophy that Darth Revan had built his empire around. He described the betrayal in enough detail to leave no ambiguity about who was responsible for it. He watched the other man's face as he spoke, looking for the collapse he expected, the fracture that would open when a person discovers that the ground they have been standing on was never what they thought it was. He did not find quite what he was looking for. Something moved in that face, something large and unfinished and not yet fully formed, but it was not the collapse Malak had anticipated. It was something more measured and more careful, the expression of a person who is receiving information that requires processing and who is, in the absence of time for proper processing, doing what he has always done, which is to hold the thing steady and continue functioning. Malak found this unsatisfying. He had expected to break something irreparable. What he was seeing suggested that the repair might already be further along than he had calculated. He released them, not out of mercy and not out of anything that could be mistaken for it. He had other plans for Bastila, and the others would not get far regardless. He let them fight their way out, which they did, at cost. And the Ebonhawk pushed through the blockade and ran for deep space. Bastila told him the rest in the quiet after escape, when the immediate emergency had resolved into something merely terrible. She sat across from him, and she told him what the council had done, and why, and what she had known, and withheld. And as she spoke, the picture assembled itself with the particular clarity of something that has always been partially visible, but has never quite been in focus. He had been Darth Revan. The entire architecture of who he had understood himself to be was a deliberate fabrication placed over a truth the council had decided was too dangerous to leave intact. She expected anger. He had a right to it. What she found was something quieter and in some ways harder to answer. He was not grateful, but he was not destroyed. He looked at what she was telling him and held it the way he held most difficult things, with a stillness that was neither acceptance nor denial, but simply the refusal to be swept away by what had just happened. He had been Darth Revan. He had done what Darth Revan had done. He had built the Empire, ordered the war, made the choices that stacked bodies across the galaxy, and drove the Republic to the edge of collapse. And he had also, in the years since his identity was rebuilt, been someone else. Someone who had defaulted consistently toward protecting people rather than using them. Someone who had rebuilt trust and earned loyalty in ways that the original Darth Revan, for all his strategic genius, had eventually forfeited. He contained both of these things. This was not a contradiction that unmade him. He was the sum of all of it. The prodigal Jedi student, and the general who had broken worlds to win a war, and the Dark Lord who had built an empire, and the rebuilt man who had spent months becoming someone new without knowing he was doing it. All of these were him, and none of them individually was the whole truth. He chose the light. He made this choice without ceremony and without an audience. In a cabin, on a ship, running from people who wanted to kill him. And it was perhaps the most significant moment of his life. More significant than the fall, because the fall had happened to him in some measure, shaped by war and vitiates corruption and the grinding pressure of years, while this was something he was doing with full knowledge and full agency, something he was choosing clearly, and for reasons he could articulate, as himself, with no part of him uninformed about what he was leaving behind. He was going to find the Star Forge. He was going to stop Malak. Not because the Council had built him to do this, and not because he owed the Republic a debt, but because he understood, more completely than perhaps anyone else alive, what the alternative looked like, and because he had looked at the person he had been becoming in the absence of memory, and he recognized something in that person that he valued and intended to keep. The companions received the news about his true identity, each in their own way and in their own time. Karth Onasi, who had carried his own betrayal wound for years, sat with the information that the man beside him had been responsible for the war that destroyed his family, and the process of arriving at some kind of workable peace with this took longer than it might have for someone with an easier history. He got there. It was not simple, and it was not complete, and it did not erase the damage. But he got there, because people who have managed to remain functional in the face of genuine catastrophe tend to be better at this kind of reckoning than their scars might suggest. The others managed as they managed, and the Ebon Hawk continued toward Lihon. The journey continued. The last star map had been found, and the coordinates were complete. Lihon was an ocean world in a system that most navigation charts flagged with warnings and few ships had visited in recent centuries, because the system had a way of pulling vessels off course, and the Rakata ruins on the surface had a reputation that kept casual exploration away. The Star Forge hung in orbit above it, catching the light of the nearby star in a way that made it look almost beautiful from a distance, the way very dangerous things sometimes do when you are not yet close enough to understand what you are looking at. It was enormous, as it had been when the Rakata built it thousands of years ago, and as it had been when Revan found it and built his empire around it. A dark wound in the sky above a world that had already been touched by too much history. The Republic fleet arrived. This had been coordinated in the time between the Leviathan and Leon. The information from the completed star maps passed along through back channels to Republic Command, and what came was the largest force the Republic had been able to assemble, pulling vessels from every theater of the war that could be reached in time. What arrived at Lehon was impressive, and also immediately insufficient in the way that anyone who understood the mathematics had expected it to be. The Star Forge had been producing ships continuously since Malak took command of it. The Sith fleet defending it was substantial, and the battle above Lehon began badly, the Republic outnumbered in ways that attrition made worse with every exchange. Revan and Bastila both understood this before the first shot was fired. They had understood it before the fleet arrived. The plan had always been two things happening in parallel. The fleet buying time above while something else happened below. And the something else was them. They went in. The interior of the Star Forge was dark in a way that was not merely the absence of light. It was dark, the way places become dark when enough violent and desperate things have happened inside them over a long enough period of time, when the accumulated weight of suffering and ambition and death has saturated the walls and the corridors until the darkness is not environmental but essential, a quality of the place itself. The dark side was present here in its most concentrated form. Not the theoretical dark side of Jedi texts, but the actual thing, immediate and heavy and pressing in at the edges of awareness, testing the boundaries of what it could reach. Revan recognized it. He had spent more time in proximity to the dark side, at closer range and over longer periods, than almost anyone he knew, and he recognized its methods the way you recognize the tactics of an opponent you have studied thoroughly. He did not engage with what it was reaching for. He walked through it the way you walk through weather, acknowledging that it is present and continuing in the direction he was already going. There were Jedi inside the Starforge, not free Jedi. Jedi who had been captured by Malak's forces and held within the station's dark architecture, suspended in a form of consumption, their life force and their connection to the Force being drawn into the machine continuously. They were not dead. They were not alive in any meaningful sense either. They were in between, sustained by the dark side in the process of being devoured by it. Revan freed them one by one. This was not on the critical path of the mission. The mission was to find Malak, to end the war at its source. But he moved through those chambers, and he broke what Malak had built, and he freed the people being consumed by it. And there was something in this that felt like accounting, like paying back something that needed paying. And each one he freed reduced the power Malak could draw on during the fight to come. He found Bastila before he found Malak. Or rather, Malak's work found him through her. She was deeper in the station, in a chamber that the dark side architecture had grown around rather than been built for. And she was waiting. Malak had worked quickly, which was a testament to how thoroughly he had understood what to press on. She had been isolated and held in the direct influence of the Starforge's accumulated dark power, told true things about herself and her family and what the Jedi Order had decided about people like her, given no counterweight to those truths except her own will, which was considerable but which has limits in everyone, and the particular relentlessness of what had been applied to her had found those limits and pushed past them. She had broken at the edge where even the strongest will gives way when enough pressure is applied from the right direction for long enough. Revan did not fight her. This is the important thing, and it is the thing that perhaps only someone who had been where he had been could have managed in that moment. Because what she was reaching for through the Force bond between them was the darkness she now inhabited, trying to draw him toward where she was rather than returning to where she had been. He had been Darth Revan. He understood the dark side, not as an enemy to be opposed, but as a territory he had lived in and knew from the inside. And he knew that fighting it in the person who was channeling it toward him on its terms was losing on those terms. He let her reach him. He let the bond work in the direction she was pushing it. And what she found when she reached through it was not the darkness she was trying to draw him into, but the thing in him that the rebuilt identity had created, the man who had chosen the light in the cabin of the Ebon Hawk with full knowledge of everything he had been, and who was now holding that choice toward her through the same connection she was using to try to pull him somewhere else. He talked to her. He said things about what she had valued before this room and what those things were worth, and whether Malak's version of the truth about her was the only version available. He said things about who she was that were neither flattery nor reassurance, but simply, as far as he could see it, accurate. He offered her the possibility that what had happened in this chamber was something that had happened to her, not something that she was. The darkness is not a trap that closes permanently. The door stays open. The light side does not revoke its connection to a person because that person has stumbled against the dark. He had tested this himself in the most comprehensive way imaginable, and he was still here. He held this toward her not as an argument but as a demonstration. She came back. It was not easy and it was not elegant, and it left something bruised in her that would take a long time to heal properly. But she came back, and as she walked out of the Starforge, her battle meditation, tentative at first, and then, with gathering strength as she recovered herself, shifted toward the Republic forces fighting above. Ships that had been losing found their coordination improving. Sith vessels that had been winning found their advantage eroding at the edges. The mathematics of the battle above Lehon began to change. Revan went deeper. The innermost chamber of the Starforge was enormous, shaped by something that had grown rather than been built. The dark side made structural over thousands of years. Malak was there, and he had been there since the infiltration began. Revan suspected. Not running. He had chosen this battlefield, and he was standing in it. And whatever he felt about what was coming, he faced it with the directness that had always been one of his qualities, even when everything else about him had changed. They looked at each other across the space of a relationship that had encompassed most of what both of them had been in the years when they were becoming who they were. Friends, first. Then the closest of companions in a war that consumed both of them. Then master and apprentice, in the oldest and most literal sense of both words. Then enemies after the betrayal, though that word does not quite capture the texture of what it means to be an enemy to someone whose face you know this well, whose voice you can hear from memory in the dark. Malak spoke. He said that what Revan was doing was impossible, that the person standing across from him was a fiction the Jedi Council had written over a man who no longer existed, and that the original would resurface eventually, because what a person truly is will not stay buried under other people's preferred version indefinitely. He said this with the conviction of someone who needed it to be true, because if it was not true, then the choice Malak himself had made was not an inevitability shaped by who he was and what the war had done to him. It was a choice he had made, and he had made it. Revan did not argue. He let Malak say what he needed to say, and he gave it the consideration it deserved, because the argument contained things that were not entirely false. The darkness had been real. The fall had been genuine. The path back had been genuinely difficult, and he did not pretend otherwise, even to himself. But the argument broke at its conclusion, because here he was, having come back, having held the choice under pressure that included, in this very room, the dark side at its most concentrated, and a force bond pulling at him through the frame of someone he loved. The impossibility Malak described had simply failed to materialize. They fought. Malak drew on the Starforge directly during the engagement, replenishing what was spent almost as quickly as it was spent, making conventional attrition ineffective. Revan had anticipated this. He found the remaining connections to the captive Jedi, whose bonds he had already broken, and severed them one by one as the fight moved through the chamber, cutting off the supply rather than trying to exhaust what was already stored. Malak felt each severance. He did not break, but he felt them, and they accumulated. Eventually, what was left was the difference between two people at the level where technique has already been decided, and what remains is will. And what determines will, at the final edge of a thing like this, is what you are standing on underneath everything else. What you are standing on when everything external has been stripped away, and what remains is the core of what you chose to be. Malak fell. He fell not all at once, the way things fall in stories, but gradually and then finally, the way things fall in reality. The power went out of him in stages, and in the space that opened up when it did, in the pause between the fight and its aftermath, something appeared in his face that had not been there before, something like recognition. He looked at the man who had beaten him, and he looked at himself and the gap between what he had expected and what had actually happened. And he understood something he had not been willing to understand before. He said that he had always been trying to step out of Revan's shadow. He said this almost to himself, not as an accusation but as an observation, clinical in the way that observations are when there is nothing left to perform for. He asked, without quite asking out loud, what might have been different? He died with the question rather than with an answer, which was, perhaps, the most honest thing about the end of him. And the question hung in the air of the chamber for a moment before the dark side, released from the focus of his will, dispersed into the Star Forge around them. The Star Forge was destroyed. The Republic fleet above Lihon, steadied by Bastila's returning battle meditation and freed from the endless mathematical replacement of Sith vessels, found the advantage shifting under their hands in a way that felt almost miraculous until you understood the mechanics of it. The fleet battle ended the way the battle inside the station had ended, with the removal of something central and essential and the collapse of everything built around it. The Jedi Civil War was over. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the end of something that has been the organizing principle of life for a long time. It is not peaceful silence, not immediately. It is more like the silence of a room where very loud music has been playing and has just stopped, a silence that contains the shape of what was in it, and that needs time to resolve into something that can be inhabited rather than simply endured. Revan stood in the light that came through the viewports of the final chamber after it was over, and whatever he felt in that moment was his, and the records do not capture it, and it belongs to him. He returned to Coruscant as something the Republic did not quite have an existing category for. The Cross of Glory was placed in his hands in the Senate chamber by senators who were still processing what he represented, and he stood in the light of the ceremony and accepted the recognition with the composed quietness that had characterized most of his public moments since his identity was restored. The Jedi Council granted him the rank of Jedi Master. It was a gesture that carried weight in both directions. Acknowledgement of what he had done and accounting, perhaps, for what they had done to him and for the ways in which the story might have gone very differently if they had made different choices at various points along the way. He received it and reserved certain conversations for later, when time had created the space for them to happen honestly. Bastila recovered. This took longer than either of them pretended, and shorter than either of them feared. The dark side's touch was not erased by the choice to walk away from it. Not immediately, and perhaps not entirely ever. But it receded, and what she was underneath it, the sincere and complicated and occasionally overcertain person who had started this journey as the Order's most valuable tactical asset and had ended it as something more difficult to categorize, reasserted itself. She was changed, and so was he, and they had the enormous advantage in navigating what they had both been through of having someone beside them who understood the full scope of it without needing to have it explained. The Force bond had not dissolved when the crisis that had perhaps catalyzed it ended. Some bonds are situational and release when the situation does. This one had rooted more deeply than that, had become structural in a way that neither of them had designed or requested, and that both had initially resisted, and that had proved, in the end, more durable than the resistance. They built a life together. On Coruscant, initially, where the aftermath of the war required attention, and where his particular combination of having seen both sides of the Force's great division from the inside made him useful in ways that the Council, however uncomfortably, found itself acknowledging. He taught when the Order would accept it. He wrote when writing was useful, and what he wrote bore the marks of a mind that had seen both sides and come back with information that most people never acquire at that level of directness. He presented to the council his ideas about the Force and the role of emotional connection in a practitioner's development, ideas that had deepened over years of seeing the Force's full character, rather than only the half the Order had chosen to face. The council rejected these ideas. He accepted the rejection without withdrawing the ideas, filing them in the category of things that the Order would need to revisit eventually, possibly by people who came after him. History would determine whether his instincts were correct. They accepted his marriage to Bastila in the particular institutional way. That means the concern is registered rather than the outcome changed. He was happy. This is worth saying plainly, because happiness is sometimes difficult to see in a person like Revan, whose contentment is more visible in what he is not doing than in what he is. He was not planning anything against the Republic. He was not managing people as instruments of some larger strategic goal. He was living in the ordinary sense of the word. The way people live when the war is over and when they have found, in its aftermath, the things that make the ordinary life worth inhabiting. Bastila was expecting their child. The future, which had felt for so long like something that had to be survived before it could be inhabited, had become something worth protecting for its own sake. But the visions had started, and they did not resolve the way he had first hoped they might. They came with increasing frequency and increasing specificity, showing him things that were not vague or symbolic in the way that Force visions sometimes are, blurry with interpretation. These were precise. A world covered in permanent storms, lightning playing across purple-black clouds in patterns that felt intentional rather than meteorological, that suggested a dark side nexus of sufficient power to influence the atmosphere of an entire planet. A darkness gathering at the galaxy's outer edge, patient and enormous, biding its time with the confidence of something that knows it does not need to hurry, because what it is waiting for will come regardless. A civilization of beings in its service, with armies and fleets and a will behind them that had been planning this for longer than anyone in the Republic had imagined. Vitiate, the true Sith Empire, the thing that had set the Mandalorian Wars in motion as a test of the Republic's defenses, that had not been deterred from its ultimate purpose by the failure of that test. And that was still there, still growing, and would come eventually on its own schedule. He was the only person who had stood in Vitiate's presence and returned with his will intact. He understood what they were dealing with in a way that no briefing could fully convey, because he had felt it from the inside, and the inside of that knowledge was something that could not be fully transmitted through second-hand account. He told Bastila everything, finally, in the way you tell someone something you have been carrying alone for too long, not as a revelation, but as a sharing of weight that had reached the limit of what could be carried alone. She listened completely, and when he was done, she sat with it in the way she sat with difficult things, not rushing to resolve it into something more comfortable, but letting it be what it was. She understood. She did not like what understanding meant, but she understood. And he told her something else, something he had been carrying separately, which was that he had to go. Not because the Republic required it officially, not because the Jedi Council had ordered it, because he was the only person equipped to make this journey, and because the visions that had come to him and not to anyone else were either a function of his particular history with what they were showing him, or something the Force had chosen, and in either case, the implication was the same. The leaving was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than Malachor V. harder than facing Malak. He stood in the doorway one morning while Bastila was still sleeping, and he looked at her for a long time, holding the arithmetic of what he was about to do. And then he went, because the kind of departure that has to happen becomes impossible if you stand in the doorway long enough. And impossibility was not an option when what was coming was what was coming. He went to find Canderous Ordo. Canderous had become the new Mandalore and had spent the intervening years in the complicated and unglamorous work of rebuilding the Mandalorian clans from the scattered remnants left by Malachor V into something cohesive and purposeful. He had been waiting, in the way that people who have known Revan long enough tend to wait, understanding that a man like that is not finished in the way that ordinary people finish. There is always another thing he has understood that no one else yet does, and eventually the understanding requires action. Together they went to Rekiad, an ice world where the Mandalorian clans had been gathering around something connected to the Mandalorian Wars, something that had been hidden deliberately by a person who understood its significance and its danger. Mandalore's mask, the ancient symbol of supreme Mandalorian leadership, had been hidden there by Revan himself in the aftermath of Malachor V. He had understood that the Mandalorians could not be permitted to reunify around a new supreme leader until a specific moment required it. That moment was now. He gave the mask to Canderous. Canderous became, in the full sense the symbol conferred, Mandalore the Preserver. And what he set about building from that point forward was the thing Revan believed the galaxy was going to need. Revan followed the trail to Nathema. He knew what he was walking into more completely than anyone who had ever approached that world had known. He knew the silence would be total, literal, the absence not of sound, but of the force itself, cut so completely from the world that you would feel its absence, the way you feel the absence of a sense you were born with and have never before been without. He went anyway, because the trail led there, and because knowing a thing is going to be difficult is not by itself sufficient argument for not doing it. Nathema was as he had feared, and more. The silence fell over him as he entered its influence, not gently but all at once, the way deep water receives you when you drop beneath the surface. He was still himself on Nathema, still had memory and intelligence and will, but he was himself in the way that a musician is themselves without their instrument, present but severed from the medium through which the deepest part of their expression moved. And he was vulnerable in ways he had not fully accounted for. Darth Nihris and Lord Scourge found him before he completed what he had come to do. The fight was brief in the way fights are brief when one side is at full capacity and the other is cut off from the power that defines their capabilities. He was captured and brought to Dromund Kaas in chains, which was a very different experience from arriving the first time. 3 years followed. Nihris tortured him systematically, with the professional thoroughness of someone for whom inflicting pain was a tool rather than a preference, mapping the terrain of his mind, pressing the edges of his endurance without pushing past them, because what lay past them was uselessness, and she was not interested in uselessness. She learned things. She did not learn everything, because certain rooms in Revan's mind stayed locked regardless of what was applied to the doors. A persistence less about technique than about the quality of will that had defined him, since he was a student in the Jedi Temple asking questions his teachers preferred not to answer. He also learned things. He learned the structure of the court around him, the factions within the Dark Council, the tensions between them. He learned about Nihris's conspiracy, the alliance of Dark Council members who had discovered the truth about Vitiate's intentions and who were trying, with the specific problem that stopping a being of Vitiate's power required something they did not yet possess, to find a way to stop him. and he learned about Scourge. Lord Scourge was the Emperor's wrath, Vitiate's personal instrument, present at Nyriss's stronghold as the Emperor's observer in a court that Vitiate understood was not entirely loyal. Over the months of watching the prisoner who never broke under torture, who looked at him sometimes with an expression that cut through the propaganda of decades and found something true underneath it, Scourge began to listen when Revan spoke. Revan spoke about Vitiate with the authority of someone who had stood in his presence, and returned about Nathema and what it felt like to stand where the Force had been entirely consumed, and what that implied for every living being in the Empire. If the Emperor achieved what he intended on a larger scale, Scourge had served Vitiate for years with the pragmatic loyalty of someone who had aligned himself with the greatest power available. What Revan was describing, carefully and with specifics that checked against things Scourge had quietly not fully explained to himself, was the possibility that the greatest power available had intentions that changed the calculation entirely. The doubt that had been growing in him slowly solidified into something that required action. He began to coordinate with Nyriss, carefully and by degrees, because Scourge was too careful for anything else, and because the Emperor he was considering moving against was fully capable of reading the thoughts of those close to him when he chose to look. Meetra Surik arrived. She had her own history with Malachor V, and with what the Mandalorian Wars had done to the Jedi Order in the years since, had walked her own complicated road back from the edge of everything. And she understood the particular kind of necessity that makes someone like Revan go looking for a threat that no one else has acknowledged. She came looking for him, and Nyriss intercepted her not to destroy her, but to use her, bringing her into the conspiracy, because what the conspiracy needed was exactly what Meetra was. They went to Revan. 3 years is a long time to be in one place against your will, and what it does to a person depends on the person. Revan was diminished in some ways, thinner, marked by what the years had extracted, but he was not broken and he was not absent. And what they found when they came to him was a man who had been waiting in the active sense of the word, understanding that patience is a form of strategy and that the moment to act arrives when it arrives. The rescue was not quiet. Nyriss died in the fighting, which was both a loss and an inevitability. What mattered was that they got out, and that they were now moving toward the thing that all of this had been building toward since Revan first saw Dromund Kaas from the outside years ago. They were going to face Vitiate. The decision to confront the Emperor directly rather than run, to take Revan back to the Republic, and warn them and prepare for a war that would come on Vitiate's schedule regardless, was not comfortable. But Revan understood timing. Every year of the Republic's preparation was a year of the Emperor's growing stronger, and the asymmetry of that arithmetic did not resolve in the Republic's favor over time. The moment to act was the moment they had. They went to the Emperor's throne room through a fortress designed to be impregnable, and that was not quite impregnable to this specific combination. Scourge knew the fortress as well as anyone alive. Meetra Surik was not someone you wanted standing between herself and her destination, and Revan carried something that had nothing to do with conventional power, which was the fact that he was, as far as any of them could determine, the only person who had faced Vitiate and survived with his will intact. And there was information in that. Information about where the edge of the Emperor's actual capability was. The throne room was vast and dark, and Vitiate was in it. And what Vitiate was in it was difficult to fully describe. He was old in a way that altered the quality of his presence, centuries of accumulated power sitting in him like sediment in still water. heavy and settled and not easily disturbed. He was not surprised. This was the most unsettling confirmation, and it was something Revan had expected and still found unsettling when it confirmed itself. Vitiate had been monitoring the situation. He had known about Nyrus's conspiracy, known about Scourge's doubts, allowed these things to proceed because they served purposes of his own. The Emperor moved in timeframes that made most other beings' strategic patience look like impulsiveness. And what was happening here fit into something larger than any of them had been told. They fought him, all three of them, in a battle that pushed against the limits of what living beings can do, in direct confrontation with something of Vitiate's magnitude. Revan and Mitra together were extraordinary. And what they managed in that throne room was something that should not have been possible, forcing the Emperor to commit fully in ways he had not expected to need, pushing him toward the edge of what the battle required. They were, for a time, winning, and then Scourge stopped. He had a vision in the heat of the battle, in the specific kind of force clarity that extreme situations sometimes open. Scourge saw something, and what he saw was not the victory that would have come from continuing to fight. What he saw was a future different from the present trajectory in which the Emperor was defeated, but not here, and not by this combination of people. A future in which someone else, not yet present and not yet born, was the key to ending Vitiate in a way that was final rather than temporary. A future in which continuing this fight would prevent that other future from occurring. He made his calculation in the space of a breath, and he acted on it. He betrayed them. He killed Mitra Surik from behind, ending her force presence abruptly and changing the balance of the battle in the Emperor's favor. He helped the Emperor recapture Revan, and then he lived with what he had done, and the vision he had seen, and the calculation he had made, and the question of whether a betrayal committed in service of a larger necessity is a betrayal or something else entirely. For the next 300 years, what happened to Revan then was something that had no precedent in any history he had studied. Vitiate, recognizing that killing him outright would waste something valuable, imprisoned him differently, not in a physical cell. In a stasis constructed of force, energy, and techniques that only a being of Vitiate's age and power had fully developed, a suspension that kept him conscious in some diminished sense while the Emperor drew on him steadily as a source of power. A living anchor of light-side energy that gave Vitiate something to push against, strengthening the dark side in the Emperor through the specific mechanism of eternal opposition. He was held in this stasis for 3 centuries. The Republic continued without him. Bastila raised their son, Vanna, who grew up knowing who his father was and not knowing where he was, and who became in his own right a remarkable person, carrying something of his father in the precision of his thinking and something of his mother in the depth of his conviction. The great galactic war that Vitiate had been planning since before either Revan or Malak had ever been born rolled out across the galaxy on a scale that validated everything Revan had understood about the threat. And the Republic, for all its intervening years of preparation, was not quite ready for it. He was in stasis while all of this happened, somewhere between consciousness and its absence, some essential part of him refusing, even across centuries, to stop being what it was. The force bond with Bastila had long since stretched beyond what it was designed to hold, attenuated by distance and time and the particular silence of stasis. But it did not entirely break, and in whatever kind of awareness he inhabited in those centuries, there were occasional moments of something that carried the texture of what had once been. He was eventually freed. A Republic strike team reached the facility where he was held in a military action that was the product of years of intelligence gathering by people who had been searching for him, and the man who emerged from stasis was not identical to the one who had entered it, in the way that anyone would be changed by 3 centuries of anything. But he was still himself, recognizably, fundamentally himself. He found the Foundry, an ancient station of Rakatan origin, similar to the Star Forge in its basic architecture and its relationship to the force of history, containing within it the capacity to produce what he had been planning in whatever portion of his mind had remained accessible during the long captivity. He built an army there, not of beings who could be killed and whose families would mourn them, but of machines, droids, programmed to do what they were built for, without the collateral suffering that came with using living instruments of war. He built them with a speed and focus that suggested the plan had been more than half-formed during those 3 centuries. Waiting in the portion of his consciousness, the stasis had not fully silenced. He intended to use them to destroy the Sith Empire, to finish what he had started when he went looking for Vitiate in the years that now felt impossibly distant. Imperial forces found the Foundry and fought their way to him, and he faced them with everything he had, which was considerable. He was not defeated easily, but he was defeated. His physical form was destroyed, which is to say, the body that had carried him through the Mandalorian Wars and the rise of his empire and the journey to Vitiate's throne room and 300 years of stasis ceased to function in the way that living bodies cease to function when enough damage accumulates. But Revan was not simply a body. He had never been simply a body. And what happened to the Force presence that had inhabited that body was not simple disappearance. The light side of him, the part that had chosen the light in the cabin of the Ebon Hawk and held that choice through every subsequent pressure, became one with the Force. This is the ordinary language for what happens to a Jedi who dies in the light. A joining of something individual with something larger, a return rather than an ending. It happened to that part of him. The rest did not go so cleanly. The dark side of him, carrying the accumulated weight of what Vitiate had done and what Malachor V had done and what 3 centuries of the Emperor's particular form of consumption had done, did not follow the same path. It remained not in the physical sense, but in something adjacent to the physical that the Force allows under certain conditions when the being in question is sufficiently extraordinary and sufficiently unresolved. It remained with an obsession, the singular purpose of completing what the light side had not managed to complete, of ending Vitiate in the final and irrevocable sense that had eluded every previous attempt. This dark aspect found the Order of Revan. They had been there for centuries. A group of practitioners who had formed around his legend, who had interpreted his dual nature as a model rather than as a tragedy, who believed that the synthesis he had always embodied was a path to be followed rather than a deviation to be mourned. They had preserved his teachings and built practices around them and waited for a return or a sign or a continuation. The dark aspect returned to them. He led them, using them as a further instrument in the campaign against the Emperor, and what he became in leading them was not the Revan who had made his choice in the cabin of the Ebon Hawk, but something narrower and harder, a consciousness shaped entirely by the one thing it had not yet accomplished, and that defined itself around that incompleteness. But the light did not stop paying attention. The resolution came on Yavin IV, on the jungle moon that had already witnessed so many pivotal moments in galactic history, and that would witness several more before the galaxy was done with it. On Yavin IV, The two halves of what had once been a single person were drawn together, and the Order of Revan and the forces assembled to oppose them met in a battle that was also, underneath the physical conflict, something more like a reckoning, a final accounting of what Revan had been and what he had done and what the sum of it amounted to. The two halves merged, light and dark, redeemer and obsessive, the man who had chosen the light and the part that had never quite made peace with what choosing the light had cost and what it had left undone, came together in the way that things divided by a long fracture sometimes come together when enough time has passed and enough pressure has been applied. And what the merging produced was not half of one thing and half of another, but something more unified than either, something that had carried the contradiction long enough to understand it from the inside and that was ready, finally, to let it go. He became one with the Force. What he left behind on Yavin 4 were the things that had been most essentially his. The mask, that strange and famous mask that was simultaneously one of the most recognizable artifacts in the galaxy and one of the least explained. The face people had put on the darkness that had shaped so many of their lives, lay on the ground of the jungle moon and became, like so many things that belonged to stories large enough, something that people would fight over and study and try to unlock for centuries afterward. His lightsaber lay beside it. The galaxy remembered him the way it always remembers people whose actions are too large and too complicated to fit the available categories. The Republic remembered him as a redeemed hero, the ultimate proof that the dark side was not a permanent state, that a person could fall as far as anyone had ever fallen and come back. This was a comforting interpretation and also not entirely wrong. The Sith, in their various later iterations, remembered him as something closer to an ideal, a practitioner who had touched both sides of the Force and been, for a time, the most powerful being alive because of it, who had refused the Jedi's insistence on purity and paid a price, and also, in some sense, proved a point. This interpretation was also not entirely wrong. Neither of them was the whole truth. Darth Bane read the history of Revan with particular attention, and what he drew from it became central to the philosophy that rebuilt Sith practice for the next 1,000 years. Bane was the Sith Lord who destroyed the fractured Sith Order of his own time and rebuilt it around the rule of two, the principle that there should be only a master and an apprentice, strength concentrated in two rather than diluted across many. The philosophy did not come only from Revan, but the history of what had happened when the Sith operated as a large and competing organization, contrasted with the period when Revan had run his empire as a tight command structure with a single Dark Lord and a single apprentice, informed Bane's thinking in ways he acknowledged and in ways that were present in the logic of what he built, whether he acknowledged them or not. The rule of two would define Sith practice until a Sith named Darth Sidious finally achieved what it was designed to make possible. A line runs from Revan's thinking to Bane to Sidious and the Death Star, a thread of terrible inheritance traveling through centuries to arrive somewhere its originator could not have imagined, which is how the most consequential ideas often travel. Bastila lived a full life. She did not stop being a Jedi, and she did not stop being who she had always been, the sincere person who had become, through everything, someone whose sincerity had been tested thoroughly enough to be trusted. She lived to be old, which was its own kind of achievement given the time she had lived through. Vanna's descendants continued, generation by generation, carrying whatever it was that made Revan's Force sensitivity the thing it was, diluted and reformed in each new person, but present, detectable, still there. Centuries later, a woman named Satila Shan became Grand Master of the Jedi Order. She was brilliant and composed and carried in the structure of her connection to the Force, something that those who knew the genealogy recognized as familiar, an echo of something older, a particular quality of depth that had not been common before her ancestor and had surfaced again in her. She could not know Revan personally, could not across the centuries between them, but she understood, as few in the Order did, what his story meant and why the easy interpretations of it, the pure redemption story and the pure cautionary tale, were both too simple to hold the actual truth of him. The story of Darth Revan does not end cleanly. It does not arrive at a conclusion that resolves all the questions it raised, that ties off the loose threads of what he was and what he chose and what those choices cost and what they made possible. He was not a hero in the mode the word usually implies, clean-handed and unambiguous. He was not a villain in the mode that word implies either, without genuine conviction, without real belief that what he was doing served something larger than himself. He was something more difficult and more honest than either. He was a man who understood the Force as a whole thing, a complete thing, and who moved through that understanding into places the Jedi Order's traditions were not designed to reach, and some of what he found there was wisdom, and some of it was corruption, and the two were never entirely separable from each other in the life of someone moving at the speeds he moved at, and through the kinds of territory he moved through. He built things, and he destroyed things, and he lost things, and he found them again, and in the end, across a life that stretched longer than any life should by any ordinary measure, he resolved into something that was neither the Sith Lord the galaxy feared nor the Jedi hero the galaxy wanted him to be, but simply, finally, the sum of everything he had chosen and endured and refused to surrender. The Republic and the Jedi Order would go on to face crises that Revan had not lived to see, but that his actions had in various ways made possible or delayed or shaped in ways that no one fully mapped until long after the fact. The stability he bought by defeating Malak bought years that the Republic used, imperfectly, and with the characteristic inefficiency of a democracy under pressure, to shore up defenses that would matter later. The Mandalorians that Canderous rebuilt under the name Mandalore the Preserver would become, in different conflicts and different eras, something other than the purely destructive force they had been during the wars that defined Revan's early life. Even the true Sith Empire, when it finally moved against the Republic in the Great Galactic War, did not find quite the prey it had originally planned for, because the years of warning that Revan had tried to provide, absorbed imperfectly by an Order and a Republic that did not fully believe in the threat, had nonetheless left traces, preparations partially made, contingencies partially planned, the shadow of a man who had tried to warn them and had not been believed but had left his understanding in the architecture of what he built and wrote and taught, and in the memories of the people who had known him. The mask is still out there somewhere, in whatever collection or vault or forgotten place it ended up in after Yavin IV. The lightsaber too. Objects that once belonged to him, shaped by his history, waiting in the silence of wherever they ended up, for the next person who comes looking for what they represent and what they cost, and what the person who left them behind understood about the Force that most people never had the opportunity or the courage to find out. The Force moves through all living things and binds them to each other and to everything that came before and everything that will come after. In this sense, the man who was born on a world whose name has been forgotten, who was found by the Jedi and trained in their halls and defied their counsel and fought a war that changed the galaxy and fell and rose and fell again and rose again and did not stop rising until the very last moment the Force would allow, is still present in some form, bound into the energy that connects everything, carried forward in every generation of his bloodline, echoed in every Sith who followed the rule of two, present in every argument the Jedi Order has ever had, about the nature of attachment and the meaning of balance, and the question of whether the Force is something to be served or something to be understood. The specific arguments he would have had with the Council are no longer available to be had because he is no longer here to make them, but the questions themselves remain exactly where he left them, exactly as unresolved, waiting for the next person with the courage to ask them and the willingness to follow them wherever they lead, which is what he was from the very beginning and what he was to the very end, still present, still himself, as he always was, through everything, still himself.